Hello, everybody. Welcome to class today. I apologize, I cannot be there today. This day, of course, being Friday, the 17th, I want to say. Yep, 17th in the year of our Lord 2026. Um, yeah, so this is not ideal, but yeah, we're gonna do it anyway. So this is going to be our second chapter. I'm going to finish up some material from chapter one real quick about the kind of aftermath of the Chinese Civil War, the aftermath of the Chinese Revolution, when the communists come to power, especially after Mao Zedong dies. But we're mostly going to be focused on the Cold War. I'm going to set a timer on my phone for a about 45 minutes or so. And at the end of that 45 minutes, I will cut the lesson off and we will pick up on Tuesday. All right. So let us begin. All right. So, where we kind of ended up yesterday for you guys is going to be the Cultural Revolution. We mostly focused on kind of how the big point of the Cultural Revolution get rid of any old, outdated system, especially in China, that being Confucianism. Kind of remember, Confucianism has things like filial piety, respect for the ancestors, kind of religious concepts as well, like Shandi, the heavens, and mandate of heaven, and the focus on the scholar gentry. What the Cultural Revolution is trying to do is to get rid of all of that cultural heritage right there and replace it with the values of Mao, specifically the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao is going to basically transform China during the Cultural Revolution into a totalitarian regime. So, a lot of the trends that you might have seen in earlier lessons, especially with the Soviet Union, are going to apply to China as well, especially during this period right here. Kind of, we are going to see that the big thing that the Cultural Revolution is aimed against is Confucianism. And there are some positive aspects of that. We do see that rights for women greatly increase, the right of divorce, the right to join the Communist Party, to become active in political life, I should say, the right to own, property, kind of, I suppose. These are some basic rights that are maintained by the Cultural Revolution. However, one could argue that the Cultural Revolution didn't really replace Confucianism, it merely kind of updated it in a way. We are going to see that, for one thing, even though there is legal equality for men and women, there still are patriarchal ideas that predominate in China during the even after the Cultural Revolution. We're going to see that as well. Kind of Confucianism is all about moral rules for living, about 12 rules for no, that's a Jordan Peterson reference. Kind of this idea of um basic ways that you should live your life on a political, social, cultural level. And kind of that's very similar to what the Cultural Revolution is kind of saying, especially with one of its most important propaganda pieces, the quotations from Chairman Mao, aka the Little Red Book, which you oftentimes see in communist propaganda during this Cultural Revolution time right here. But in addition to kind of the cultural changes, the Cultural Revolution was a political one. Kind of remember, Maoism is against the outdated old system, constantly getting rid of things that are considered outdated, old-fashioned. And kind of a part of that is getting rid of political opponents. Mao Zedong is essentially establishing absolute dominance over China thanks to his Cultural Revolution. And kind of one way that he does that is by raising a generation of Chinese people to be loyal Mao supporters. And kind of the group that we associate with this is the Red Guard. They're kind of a youth organization. Mao is kind of treat them as his personal followers, basically. And the Red Guards, they're going to be in literally kind of trying to promote cultural values of the Cultural Revolution in everyday life. We do see that they are encouraged, these young people are encouraged to spy on their teachers, spy on their parents, report kind of counter-revolutionary opinions and thoughts. And the Cultural Revolution, kind of like the purges that we saw in Stalin in the Soviet Union. Now, a big thing to remember yeah, that's kind of the big thing to remember, I guess, is that the Red Guards, very similar to totalitarian systems we've seen in Germany and in the Soviet Union. Not to, yeah. All right. Anyway. However, Mao Zedong is not going to live forever. He is going to die. And we do see that after Mao's death, this is where that kind of modern China will, or something that is more similar to what we know and understand about China, is going to pop up. For one thing, kind of what we see especially change after Mao's death is getting rid of the strict central planning of the Communist Party under Mao Zedong, especially as he is replaced by Deng Xiaoping. Of the Chinese communist leaders that you need to know about, Mao is important, obviously. Deng Xiaoping is also important, mostly because of his economic effects in China. Last time we talked about the Great Leap Forward in China. This essentially was the attempts at modernization in China under a system that is very similar to Joseph Stalin's five-year plans. But what we're going to see happen under Deng Xiaoping is that he realizes the reason why industrialization failed under the Great Leap Forward was that there was honestly, no capitalist stage in Chinese history. Kind of China, according to Maoists, according to guys like Deng, they believed that China was locked in a feudalistic state. And Claude is uh, right here, rubbing up against my laptop and is pressing all these buttons right here. Anyway, kind of what Deng Xiaoping does is that he kind of says, maybe we need to take a step back. In order for us to achieve full communism, maybe we've got to manipulate the economy a little bit to promote industrial capitalism. And kind of that's what's going to happen under Deng Xiaoping's reforms when he becomes the new leader of China after Mao's death. Basically, what happens is that some elements of capitalism are allowed into the Chinese economy. We see that there is the privatization of some businesses. Kind of private property ownership greatly increases. Those collectivized farms, some industry, those are going to be handed over to certain Chinese everyday people. We kind of do see that a business class will form in China, and kind of we do see privatization, so kind of transferring ownership from the state to private individuals. We are going to see consumer products because kind of the thought process is we can't industrialize because no one wants to produce anything. And kind of what is going to make people want to produce things is a profit incentive. And kind of in order to get this profit incentive, we need to have products that people want to buy and want to sell. So consumer products become a bigger focus of the Chinese economy, not just things like steel and electricity that we saw in the Great Leap Forward. But we also do see that under Deng Xiaoping, there is going to be allowance of private individuals too, or I should say foreign companies to invest in China. Kind of that is going to be something that does allow for Chinese industry to grow up, is going to be investment by foreign businesses. This was a trend that was starting to happen under Nixon, actually, or under Mao, actually. We did see kind of opening relations with capitalist countries like that of the United States. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on, actually. And it will talk about why the Chinese and the United States kind of become good friends economically anyway in the 1970s. Anyway, kind of the results of this new economic policy like program under Deng Xiaoping is going to be China becoming a major industrial power. It's a slow process. Eventually, kind of, we see that China becomes on par with the United States, especially by the end of the 20th century, start of the 21st century. Now, kind of the system that China has is a little bit complicated, and I'm not going to explain it perfectly, but for what you need to understand is that it combines elements of free market capitalism with some socialism. Kind of there is some government businesses, some government-owned businesses. There is definitely government regulation of the economy. There are kind of rules and regulations for monopolies, but kind of it's a system in which big business does benefit. And kind of we call this system collectively, by some people anyway, state capitalism. Kind of specifically, the Chinese call this socialism with Chinese characteristics. So kind of adapting to the circumstances of what China is like because of its history, we are going to kind of mess with pure socialism, and we are going to introduce some capitalism. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in a way, and the effect is very successful. Sorry, Claude got stuck in the window. Anyway, in terms of kind of social and cultural things, some of the gains of the Cultural Revolution stick around, especially with regards to rights for women, especially in regards to secularization. However, kind of we do see that there are some developments that happen post Mao Zedong. For example, kind of that focus on cultural permanent revolution, that focus on trying to change everything about the old order, that largely is going to start dying down. Kind of China is considered an authoritarian government by by the 1980s and even into the present day. But it's kind of debatable if it's a totalitarian system. And kind of we do see that focus on the cult of personality around the central leader, that's largely not a major factor or as major of a factor as we saw at the Cultural Revolution under Mr. Mao Zedong. There isn't kind of a cult of personality around the current leaders of China, although that is debatable among some people. Anyway, can we also see that another big change that happens during this time is China's concern with overpopulation, and this is actually going to lead to kind of specific government programs that have big effects on Chinese history. For example, we do see the adoption of what we call anti-natalist policies. You might have learned about this in Human Geo last year, but anti-natalism is essentially kind of uh, trying to prevent families from having babies. And kind of the reason why China's population has skyrocketed, especially after the kind of famines of the Great Leap Forward are ended with this new kind of economic system under Deng Xiaoping. Chinese population is growing. So, in order to kind of control this a little bit in urban centers, especially one-child policy, families in urban centers, one kid. Now, this kind of relates to another idea that I introduced is that while the Cultural Revolution tried to change a lot of things, especially when regards to the status of women, we do see that culturally some patriarchal ideas are still prevalent because families oftentimes are going to prefer having one type of child, that, of course, being the best gender according to kind of old, outdated ideas, men. So actually, kind of a problem in China as a result of this one child policy is we are only kind of seeing single men, and kind of that is going to be a population concern even in the present day. Single, unmarried men not getting wives. Where are they going to get wives? Who knows? They are going to marry each other. No, anyway, let's continue. However, kind of some other kind of things about present day China, some political challenges that still exist in the country to the present day. China is still a one-party state. It calls itself a communist nation, but kind of whether or not that's an accurate label, that is up for historical debate. But regardless, kind of China still is authoritarian. We do see limits on freedom of speech. We do see as well political corruption, economic inequality. There is a lack of true democracy, especially at the workplace level. And kind of that is a big area of discussion in the present day as well. Kind of the problems China faces, very similar to the problems that, say, the United States faces. Kind of accusations of corruption, accusations of political centralism, all these terrible, wonderful things. We especially also see that there are movements against this horrific some abuses to human rights. For example, we see that in the 1980s, there was a movement that was actually kind of protesting not just for greater democracy, but also for a return to socialism in some cases, a return to kind of more social welfare programs that were cut under Deng Xiaoping's privatization efforts. And kind of in the 1980s, specifically in 1989, there's a series of protests across the country, but mostly centralized in Beijing, the capital of China, known as the Tiananmen Square protests. Kind of the crackdown, the leaders of these revolutions, of this kind of movement before I begin, though, mostly younger students, mostly intellectuals, and it is going to lead to political repression. We see imprisonment, re-education, and in some cases, police brutality in the form of murder. Now, the kind of image right there, very famous one, it's oftentimes misrepresented. This guy was kind of just walking around. He's not actually run over by the tanks, but he's viewed as this symbol of this resistance against the Chinese state in the Tiananmen Square protests. Anyway, we do see as well China is a major player in the present day because of its economy, but also because of its disputes with its borders in terms of its neighbors. Kind of China, in the present day, there's a lot of debate and concern about where does China begin, where does China end in terms of its borders? Kind of debates over territorial sovereignty, such as in Tibet, such as in Taiwan, Hong Kong, the South China Sea. These places are in constant kind of border disputes between China and its neighbors and its geopolitical rivals, including the United States, for example. All right. So, with all of that out of the way, we can get to talking about the main topic of today's lesson, that being the Cold War. You might have learned about the Cold War in previous history classes. We're going to talk about it in the context of our class, what you need to know for the AP. Now, the Cold War is going to define global politics really for the rest of the 20th century until the fall of the Soviet Union. So, from the end of World War II to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Now, you might have known the definition of the Cold War. We've talked about it, at least in passing, before in this class. But essentially, the Cold War is competition over the two new superpowers of the 20th century, the United States and the Soviet Union. Kind of after World War II, as we'll talk about later, the two dominant superpowers left standing after that devastating global conflict is the United States and the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, aka the USSR, aka the Soviet Union. And kind of these two superpowers, rather than cooperate with each other, are actually going to kind of view that in the interest of national security, we must spread our respective ideologies. I'll talk about that idea of respective national security kind of concerns in a second. But kind of we are going to see the try and attempt to spread, or at least contain the spread of the other side, their respective ideology. And kind of we do see that the Cold War, the reason why it's called that is that the Soviets and the Americans, despite hating each other, despite having opposite political and foreign policy interests, they are never going to actually declare war on each other. And the reason is, if they did, the entire world would end. And can we call this concept mutually assured destruction? But why would the world end? It's the introduction of that key new technology at the end of World War II, atomic weapons. The United States developed atomic weapons throughout the Second World War, and the Soviet Union in the 1940s was beginning to develop its own nuclear weapons as well. So, if there was a direct war between the Soviet Union and the United States, this could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. Everybody would suffer in the world. Basically, Fallout, the video game, would become a real life thing. Or the video game series, I should say. Play video games, folks, but never mind. All right. So, kind of that's the reason why there isn't a direct conflict, even though kind of both have rival foreign policy interests. They want to see the spread of their respective ideologies because they need allies. They want allies to kind of secure their own national security. And kind of the way that kind of these respective ideologies are spread, some of it is through covert, a little less directly violent means. For example, propaganda, economic assistance to allies, the creation of military alliances, the kind of technological race. But also, we do see kind of things like covert operations. What that basically means is kind of spies, for example. It means kind of using espionage to promote kind of government change in non-aligned nations, as we'll see later on. The technology race, the arms race, this is going to be kind of a desire to not be the weaker country, basically. We need to develop a more modern, more robust, more technologically advanced military. That means an arms race. Who has the most amount of nuclear weapons? And we'll talk about what proxy wars are in a lot more detail later. but essentially a proxy war is where the countries don't directly fight, they fight through proxies, aka through smaller allies. And we'll look at some famous examples of these proxy wars later on. Now, in terms of the camps, who is actually fighting and who are they fighting over? For example, we see the First World. We sometimes call this the Western Bloc. And what First World means is not the most advanced countries out there necessarily. It just simply means countries that are allied or at least have the same interests as the United States. That's what we call alignment right there. You are aligning yourself with the interests of the capitalist superpower, the United States of America. And we'll look at a map that kind of shows where kind of supports the United States, who supports the United States. The Second World, these are the communists, aka, I should say more accurately, the allies of the Soviet Union. We can sometimes call this collectively the Eastern Bloc. These are communist nations, the Soviet Union being the most important of them, but they include Eastern European countries like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, like East Germany. They also include countries like Cuba. China is kind of a little bit complicated of a story. We'll talk about that more in chapter 3. China, even though it calls itself a communist nation, is actually going to align itself with our third element of the Cold War, the Third World. Kind of China is going to switch back and forth between second and third world, but what third world means is not necessarily a poor country, that's kind of the modern day connotation, but it means in the context of the Cold War, a non-aligned nation. The AP probably prefers non-aligned, but you might see third world pop up on stuff online, for example, on study materials, etc. And what non-aligned means is, well, you're not allied with either the Soviets or the Americans. And kind of it's this group that the Americans and the Soviets are competing for influence over. Some of these places will become allies to the United States and the Soviet Union thanks to things like propaganda, covert operations, etc. And mostly these non-aligned countries are the recently independent states in Africa and Asia, but also countries in Latin America who are fighting off economic imperialism. And we'll kind of see how this looks later on, especially in chapter 3, when we talk about the non-aligned movement and decolonization in a bit more detail. This is a map of the world, kind of showing what I mean by these alignments right here. This is the map of the world in 1979 specifically. Again, China kind of back and forth between who it's allied with. Anyway, blue countries, those are the allies of the United States, obviously, because it includes the United States. The red countries, these are the allies of the Soviet Union, or at least ideologically similar to the Soviet Union. But I really want to draw us attention to the green areas. These are the non-aligned nations. These are the recently independent nations. And it's going to be kind of the battleground of the Cold War, so to say. Because the Soviets and Americans, they want allies, they want friends, they want influence, they want to be the ones who kind of decide what goes on in these post-independent, newly formed governments. There's a lot of fresh ground for new government systems in Africa and Asia thanks to decolonization. So, who are you going to side with in this bipolar world between communism and capitalism? Some of these places will eventually turn to the United States or the Soviet Union. Some of these places try to keep a middle path. All right. You should be able to identify what the Cold War is. You should be able to identify who the factions are. So let's take a look at the causes of the Cold War. And honestly, the answer is World War II. There were tensions that existed during the war and in the period immediately afterwards. And kind of during World War II, remember that there was a lot of tensions between the Allies themselves, the Allies especially being the UK, the US, and the Soviet Union. And even though they could put aside their differences for the sake of fighting their common enemy, that being the Nazis in Germany, that being imperialist Japan, especially by the end of the war, it couldn't kind of be resolved, these tensions between these rival ideologies, the communists in the Soviet Union and the capitalists in the UK and the greatest country on earth, the United States of America. Now, specifically, the big disagreement, especially prevalent over the Yalta Conference in in 1940, early 1945, is going to be debates over what the world is going to look like once the war is over. And kind of remember that at the Yalta Conference, this is where the fate of Europe was decided, especially kind of concerning what Europe will look like after the war is over. And kind of the big sticking point, the big controversy is going to be the question of actual self-determination in Eastern Europe, the right of Eastern Europeans to pick out their own government leaders. Kind of the US and the UK, these being democracies, these being capitalist countries, they believed that it was the right of Eastern European nations, once the war was over, to have the ability to elect their own leaders, free from Soviet Union influence. Whereas the Soviet Union, what they wanted out of Eastern Europe was these places to be independent, but more like puppet governments, kind of more like governments that are controlled by ideological allies to the Soviet Union. Kind of the reason why the Soviet Union wanted a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe was to act as a buffer. So again, national security interests. We want a group of countries between us and the Soviet Union and the Western parts of Europe. And think about this for a second, kind of putting ourselves in the shoes of the Soviet Union a little bit. It seems unreasonable they want to deny the ability of democracy in Eastern Europe, and that is unreasonable on some level. But can I think about this for a second? The Soviet Union had been through three devastating wars, all three of them partially included invasions from the West. The First World War, the Soviet Union didn't exist yet, obviously, but Russia did. The First World War was devastating. The Russian Civil War was devastating, and that included outside intervention. The Second World War was obviously very devastating. And essentially, kind of Joseph Stalin, the current leader of the Soviet Union, is going to say, I don't want to be invaded again. I at least want kind of a buffer, a wall of protection between myself and the rest of the world. So if we want that buffer zone, we got to spread communism. And kind of the United States and the Soviet Union are scared that if communism's allowed to spread, it could eventually reach the US. It could reach this United Kingdom. So, kind of these tensions that existed during the war are going to break out after the war is over. We are going to see that anxiety about national security for the Soviet Union, especially when it comes to military technology. This is what leads to the arms race. During World War II, obviously, the United States developed its own nuclear weapons, its atomic bomb, and we're going to see that the Soviet Union is terrified by that. Because if they are in competition with the Western world, with the United States especially, and the United States has an atom bomb and the Soviets don't, the Americans have the advantage. So, kind of in order to close the gap of nuclear weapons, this is where the American or the Soviet Union begins developing its own nuclear weapons program. We're also going to see again that concept of trying to spread communism is called a world revolution. Stalin kind of backtracks his idea of socialism in one state by actively supporting the spread of communism into other countries. We see that kind of when the Soviet Union was invading German-held territory, they left their military in Eastern Europe. They allowed for these places in Eastern Europe to become their own independent countries, but kind of the military of the Soviet Union remains, and it's going to influence local elections for, surprise, surprise, the communists to get in power. And kind of we see that these communists coming to power in Eastern Europe and in China, as we saw later, kind of the Soviets consider these places satellite states, aka countries that border your nation and but are basically acting as puppet states, kind of controlled by the bigger, more dominant superpower. And we call collectively kind of these satellite states, these buffers between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world, namely Western Europe. These are sometimes called the Eastern Bloc, as we introduced earlier. Now, this spread of communism seems undemocratic, especially to the United States. The United States responds with a policy known as containment. And basically, containment, think about this for a second. if someone is sick and you don't want them to spread their illness to other people, you need to quarantine them, keep them away from others so that they can't spread their illness. And kind of this is what containment basically is. We are going to contain, limit the spread of communism by basically supporting every anti-communist group and government out there in the world. That is going to be kind of what containment is. All right. If you have any questions, make sure you ask me either through email or in person. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. So make sure you watch this video first, then ask me questions. Claude, you are a little rodent. I love you, though. Anyway, how do the Soviets and the Americans spread their ideology? Well, one way is through propaganda, kind of propaganda that is being beamed not just to people living in the Soviet Union or the United States, but more importantly, people living outside of the Soviet Union. We kind of see that the purpose of propaganda is, and the United States, and is to kind of show the benefits of your economic and political system. Kind of we do see that there's a big focus in the United States, for example, of trying to promote American ideology in communist held areas. And we especially see this in the form of secret communication, secret underground kind of radio broadcasts in the form of things like Radio Free Europe. This is a US-led program to essentially broadcast American propaganda into Europe to promote American democratic values and show the benefits of American capitalism. We've got economic prosperity. We have political freedom. Enjoy these things. Change your communist governments, people in oppressed Europe. The Soviet Union does the same thing, though, but they're going to mostly aim their propaganda at countries that have recently become independent. These newly independent countries are fresh ground for new ideologies, new government systems to potentially take root. So, especially in countries in Africa and Asia, this is where the Soviets devote a lot of their time to their news agency, the TASS, the Telegram Agency of the Soviet Union. It's essentially the state media right here. And kind of the TASS is going to send messages into and report on places like the Congo, for example. We see that kind of in these places, though, they also get news of the benefits of the Soviet Union. There's lower economic inequality, even though there isn't a lot of political freedom. We're not going to talk about that. But there's greater opportunities for equality between men and women. We don't have a problem with racism, mostly because there's not a lot of non-white people that live in our country. But we do see that there is kind of some benefits of the Soviet system as well. So, propaganda kind of subtly influencing governments to change their minds, and then a bit more directly is through covert operations. Covert operations, think spies, basically. Spies that are not only going to do things like not corporate espionage, technological espionage, kind of monitor the capabilities of the militaries of your enemies, but also through things like regime change. And this is going to be kind of the responsibility and realm of organizations like the CIA, the United States Central Intelligence Agency, and the KGB from the Soviet Union. The KGB, it's like the National Committee on Security or something like that. I can't remember the exact acronym off the top of my head, but the KGB, that's the spy agency of the Soviet Union. And kind of what I mean by regime change is overthrowing a government you don't like, replacing it with a government that you do like, one that is friendly to your interests. The Soviet Union does do this in the form of invading kind of countries to prop up communist allied governments. Hungary's an example, Afghanistan's an example, but the United States also does this as well, and a bit more extreme in my opinion. For example, we are going to see things like overthrowing the democratically elected socialist in Iran. And we'll talk about this more in chapter 3, actually. But kind of the use of covert operations, kind of organizing local rebels to overthrow a government you don't like that much. That's a bit more of a subtler approach to spreading your ideology. In addition to this, we also see economic aid to prop up our allies, our friends in the world, making sure they are strong enough and are not going to fall victim to communist or capitalist invasion. And kind of we do see that a big part of spreading influence is through economic assistance. And kind of two big examples of this in Europe anyway. One of them's the Marshall Plan. This is kind of an important term because it's going to be really relevant next year in A push, obviously, but it's relevant in this class as well. The Marshall Plan was an American initiative of sending over basically billions of dollars, I think like $13 billion of economic assistance to Western European countries after World War II. The point of this money was to kind of help rebuild, to help build up social welfare programs. Kind of the reason why countries in Western Europe have universal healthcare and we don't, the reason why they have universal college, is because they honestly didn't have to spend anything on the military, but they also got a lot of assistance from the United States. Now, why is the United States promoting these quasi-socialist welfare programs in Western capitalist countries? It's because they kind of want to pull the wind out of the sails of socialist and communist political parties in Western Europe. The reason why socialists and communists ever come to power, as we've seen historically, is that there's economic inequality. If we get rid of that economic inequality, communists don't come to power. That's kind of the thought process of why we're giving so much aid and assistance to Western Europe. And kind of a similar thing happens in Eastern Europe as well. In kind of response to the Marshall Plan, the Soviet Union develops an organization called Comecon. Comecon essentially is the communist organization of kind of mutual economic assistance. That's more or less of what it is. Basically, kind of to rebuild countries like Poland, countries like East Germany, countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, etc. We are going to establish economic trust with these countries so that they are our friends, so that they are not falling victim to capitalist propaganda. Make sure that their economic needs are met so they're not thinking, hey, maybe we should move away from a planned economy to a free market one. Military alliances are also a way to kind of prevent the other side from spreading their ideology. Example, kind of we see mutual protection treaties. A very important example of this in Western Europe is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Basically, this is a military alliance between North American countries like the United States and Canada and Western European countries. And the basic provision of NATO is if one country is invaded, if one member country is invaded, every single other member country promises to mutually protect and defend that nation from an outside aggressor. And in the context of the Cold War, it was the communist Soviet Union. The communists, the Soviet Union, responds by making its own mutual protection plan known as almost said the Marshall Plan, known as the Warsaw Pact. Basically, if one communist country is invaded, every communist country member in the Warsaw Pact comes to their aid. But finally, kind of, I think what we're going to wrap up on today, or maybe we have enough for one more, is going to be proxy wars. Kind of proxy wars are basically indirect fights. We're never seeing a direct confrontation between the Soviets and Americans. Again, that fear of nuclear weapons being dropped is a great one. Rather, we are going to fight by proxy. Imagine, if you will, that Euro and World are in a competition over influence of the freshman class. We want to make sure that these young freshmen join World versus Euro. And kind of what we see is that rather than, again, Euro and World fighting, we're going to see that we're fighting by proxy. So, for example, let's just say that there's an election that's going to be held in one of Miss Ingram's classes, one of the human geo classes. And kind of the election is going to be deciding, are we going to have every student here join World, or are we going to have every student here join Euro next year? And kind of in order to make sure that the vote goes a certain way, we are going to, as World people, send guns and weapons to our allies in the young freshman class. Now, kind of these guys, they're going to fight against the other side who are being given guns, weapons, ammunition from the Euro classroom. So that's kind of a little bit of a silly comparison right there. Now, kind of obviously, who are the United States going to support? We're going to support anybody who's a anti-communist, the Soviet Union, anyone who is a communist. Now, this kind of idea of the Cold War being a fight between communism and capitalism is sometimes dressed up as between authoritarianism and democracy. That's not necessarily the case because we do see that the Soviets, authoritarian nation, but the United States is allies in the Cold War, especially in the kind of areas like Asia and Africa. Some of them are not going to be the best, most democratic nations. We do see that the United States is going to support anybody who hates communism. Drug smugglers in Nicaragua, religious Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan, dictators up and down Latin America, up and down Africa, throughout East Asia, and also in some cases just outright fascists. For example, former Nazis in places like West Germany, for example, in places like Greece, in places like Turkey and Italy, anyone who's not a communist. And kind of we see that these proxy wars, they're especially going to be prevalent as decolonization is taking place. The kind of process of decolonization, which we'll talk about more in our third chapter, is happening at the same time as all of these developments, which is why it's paired up with the Cold War. And kind of decolonization in Africa, kind of unfortunate results of it is going to be political instability and kind of civil wars will emerge. And kind of in order to make sure our guys come out on top, this is where proxy wars come out in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we'll talk about some examples of these proxy wars more in our third chapter. The most famous and most important for our class, or at least the one that we will talk about the most, is the Vietnam War in, you guessed it, Vietnam, a fight between communists, largely supported diplomatically and militarily by the Soviet Union, and anti-communists in the South, supported by the United States. But the Korean War is a good example of this. The Angolan Civil War is a good example of this. We won't talk about those two, though, as much. Now, finally, where I think I'm going to end this lesson and where I think Claude is going to come and, ooh, hello, interrupt me is going to be the technological side of the Cold War. Kind of in order to make sure that you are the dominant superpower, you got to have the most advanced technology, the most advanced military, more importantly. And kind of what we see happen in the Cold War is a technological arms race. Kind of one way that the Soviets and Americans competed for influence over who is the bigger superpower is going to be the technological arms race. We do see that both sides will greatly expand their nuclear missile, nuclear weapon capabilities in the period of the Cold War. And kind of we do see that it is going to get pretty bad. The fear of nuclear war is one that was a realistic possibility because if tensions get so bad between the Soviets and Americans, things could snap, things could start a war, and that war would inevitably lead to nuclear weapon usage. So, kind of that fear of nuclear warfare is definitely a presence in the world, not just in the United States and the Soviet Union, but everywhere else. Nuclear war would be bad for every country on Earth, even if it just impacted those two countries, because it would not just impact those two countries. Now, a kind of trend of the 20th century and of the 21st century is that wars always tend to bring out the worst of scientists. And what I mean by that is technological advancement. Kind of in order to stay competitive, technology is going to greatly increase. And it's not just things like rockets and missiles and nuclear weapons, it's things like computers as well. It's things like radar, it's things like airplanes. So, kind of military technology is always going to advance during periods of warfare, but it also advanced even during the Cold War, where there isn't any direct war going on. And kind of a related aspect to this is the space race, actually. Kind of what I mean by the space race is who's going to have access to outer space. And why is that important or relevant? Because kind of nuclear missiles being able to go into space, they can go longer distances, strike at the enemy, whoever they may be. And kind of a big aspect of the kind of Cold War is the space race. The Soviet Union kind of kicks it off in 1957 by launching Sputnik. Sputnik is the first artificial satellite to be successfully launched into orbit around the Earth, which includes the United States, obviously. And kind of that is going to spark off this competition. America makes NASA. I forget the agency that the Soviet Union comes up with. I don't think it's a single one, but it's a bunch of different kind of agencies altogether. And the United States I hate the argument that we won the space race. Well, we landed a guy on the moon. The Soviets launched a guy into space. The Soviets made the first space station. The Soviets landed rovers onto Venus and Mars, etc. The United States, wow, we got th two guys to bounce around on the moon and pick up rocks and go back home. That's so cool. I mean, that is objectively cool, but like it's pointless. Nobody believes that they went there. Something like 25% of Americans, that statistic might be a little high. I can't remember if that's changed or not. Something about a quarter of Americans don't believe the moon landing happened. Even more people in Britain don't believe that it happened. I mean, it did happen. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of evidence and proof that it did. We're not talking about the moon landing right now. Anyway, technology advances even during the Cold War, or especially during the Cold War, more accurately. All right. I've got about a minute left, and that was about 45 minutes altogether. I think I'm going to wrap up today's lesson right here. Now, I have a little bit of an extra credit opportunity, actually, if you stick around for all those who actually watch this video. If you send me an email to my TUSD email, that being benjamin.ancharski@TUSD1.org, by the end of today, that being March 17th, 2026, in the year 2026, 11:59, if you send me an email that one identifies what type of animal I called Claude, I know he's a cat, but what type of animal I called him, and if you kind of give a 3 to 4 sentence summary of today's lesson, both of the China stuff and of what the Cold War was and how it was being fought. All right. That is it. If you send that to me by 11:59, I will give you 5 points of extra credit. All right. If you have any questions, let me know. Like and subscribe. No, just kidding. You don't have to like and subscribe. If you want to, go ahead, Mazel Tov. Do whatever you want. But yeah, okay. And that's the timer right there. I was stalling for that. All right, have a excellent day today. The reason why I am not at work is because at school is because my friend is getting married tomorrow, actually. But I am in the wedding party, so I need there's a dress rehearsal, and also Claude has a appointment as well. My beautiful, sweet little baby cat. Do you want to come over here? You want to say hi to the camera? Claude, come over here. You can see his tail every now and then. Look. No, I won't lift it up further. Come here. Come here. Come here. Do you want to get pet? Claude, come here. Baby, come here. Baby, come here. Baby, come here. Oh, there we go. Come on. Oh, yes, you're a baby. Oh, my goodness gracious me. Hello. Yes, you're a baby. Oh, my goodness. All right. I should stop there. Have a great rest of your day. Be good, human beings. I very much have appreciated teaching you guys this year. That is not me kind of just saying that. I think you are, quite frankly, a lot better than last year's sophomores. I enjoy our I know the year is almost over and I know things are stressful and but I've appreciated your participation so far. I thought it was really great at the beginning of the year, beginning of the semester. And I understand that it's almost over, folks, because it is. Have a great rest of your day. One love. Um, ain't no Planet X coming, 'cause ain't not space, 'cause ain't no globe Earth. I'll leave you on that. Cheers, folks. And stop. And